professor, all the way to professor, chair of a department, then dean of College of Arts and Sciences at one point, then up to provost, and throughout all this time, he still maintained his research lab, still maintained his graduate student training, postdoc training, and funding continuing throughout this time. So this is a really unique capacity. So he certainly has quite a bit of information that I encourage everyone to tap into. I do, as a colleague, always try to ask for information support. He has so much to give in that matter. He has given this particular workshop in various ways, not just within the US, but also within Mexico and China. So he's not only sought after around campus for this information, but internationally. So that tells you something as well. I've been able to hear it through one of his workshops that he did for the College of Science, and so I definitely think that everyone in this room will probably take not just one, but many aspects that you can learn from. And so I think that's wonderful that you're volunteering your time to do this. You'll certainly learn from Warren. So thank you for attending, and also thank you, Warren, for volunteering to do this.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, so probably almost everybody in this room would probably rather be somewhere else on a Friday afternoon. Okay, I'm one exception. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon. And Pam and I were just talking about the fact that if one person learns one thing that just puts them over the edge into the win or the pay column, then I think all the time that has been invested would be more than worth it. So I'm going to loosen up here. We're going to be here for a bit. And I'm going to start by setting the tone here. Okay, for those of you who are compulsively interested in where we are in this lecture, or want to know in particular when you can fall asleep or when you can wake up, along the top here you're going to see the various topics that we're going to be dealing with. Grants and contracts, public-private, finding dollars, preparation, writing, publishing, God forbid, V2, the second time you have to submit, and then questions. So watch that. Now this is not a lecture, okay? I'm not going to be going blah, 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 this is what you do, although there may be too much of that. What I really want you to do is be sure and ask questions. Don't bother to don't bother or worry about interrupting me at any point in time. I'm happy to do that. And if I know something's coming, I might say just wait a couple slides. If that's a good time to address it right then and there, right, we'll do it. This is a lecture. Please ask questions, and I look forward to seeing what your view is. Now, looking around the room, I know there's some experience in this room. Okay, there's some grizzled veterans here. And I love it when someone puts up their hand and says, Warren, I had a contract and here's what went wrong. Or here's a trick that I learned with this particular agency. That's great, because hopefully you'll all learn a little bit, but every time I've given this, I've gotten feedback or had an aha moment as I'm standing up here that has helped me improve this. And maybe there's a lesson right there. This is V6 of just what I've been working on in the last month or so, version 6. Okay, so polish, polish, polish. I'm getting ahead of myself there, but that's part of the point. Now, to be very clear, okay, I'm not a guru. I'm not a white knight that's riding in that's telling you how to do it. Okay, that's not the case. As Pam mentioned, I have had funding. Now I've got in place funding for what will be 40 straight years since 1979. In case any of you are trying to do the math, this is my mother, okay? Sorry, this is my mother giving me congratulations on getting my first NSF grant. So that makes me in, my 40s, something like that. Maybe this is a little more realistic. These are the big hair days. Some of you may have participated in that or remembered that.
Or still do.
Yeah, or still do. Perfect, exactly right, exactly right. Most of my support over the years has been from the National Science Foundation, but I've also diversified. And we hear about diversifying as an economy. We hear about diversifying a stock portfolio. We'll bring up that subject right now. But it's also really important in terms of thinking about where do I get money and where do I go. As I said, I've been very fortunate with NSF, but over the years, all of these places in one way or another have contributed to the research of our students and our postdocs in the laboratory. And so that's an important thing to do is broaden your vistas. Don't keep banging away at the same place. Or rather, do keep banging away at the same place, but also expand the possibilities of places that you'll look. And how you find those dollars, those places to go to, I'll talk a little bit later in this workshop. So you can ask the question, and I do frequently, why this success, at least numerically, what's the success that I have had in grants? Well, it's not because I know some secret. It's not like there's a secret decoder ring and handshake and some know it and some don't. Okay, it's not that. And I'm not reversing global warming or curing cancer or doing something that's just incredibly interesting to a large number of people. And it sure as hell isn't because I'm smarter. Okay, I would attribute it to the fact that I put everything I have into writing a grant proposal. And when I'm done writing a grant proposal, it's not, okay, now I'm on to working on a lecture or working on to a manuscript. I am played out. And I will tell you a little later in this just how much effort. Everybody's going to have a formula when they're putting grants together, but just how long it can take. So if I would attribute anything to the success I had, it's because, well, I guess I should attribute it to my parents and the work ethic that they instilled in me. Also, I never write practice or feeling out or trial balloon proposals. And I'm going to emphasize that in a little while. Okay, that is a waste of time for a whole bunch of people. Because the marginal difference between a good proposal and a great proposal is quite narrow. And if you're going into this with, I'm just going to see if people want to fund this, I can predict 100% what the result will be. This is perhaps the most important thing, is that I've learned to accept temporary setbacks. You've all heard the saying, don't get mad, get even. Don't let the bastards grind you down. There's a bunch of sayings like that. And I was terribly disappointed with the setback that I had of a major NSF proposal that I had submitted, was turned down, and they didn't say no, they said hell no. Okay, so for a week or two, I didn't even want to look at the reviews. I finally looked at the reviews, and then I didn't want to process it and think about it. But now that I've been thinking about it for about a month or so, it's like, okay, I'm going to, don't get mad, get even. I'm going to show this panel that, in fact, my ideas are worthy of funding, but as is almost always the case, and I think many of you know this from submitted manuscripts and things like that, if somebody doesn't understand what you're doing, whose fault is that? Okay? If people are busy and they've got 10 or 15 proposals to read and you haven't been clear and they should know the literature, etc., you're basically putting a lot of effort on the reviewers. So I always say, ultimately, you know, when I've had a few drinks and kind of calmed down and thought about it, okay, it's my fault. I didn't make it clear enough. So, some people have said, Warren, you've been lucky over the years. Well, I don't deny that, but you know, it's this saying, the harder I work, the luckier I am, has been attributed to a whole bunch of people. Gary Player, Stephen Leacock in Canada. It probably goes back to Confucius. There are versions and iterations of this that those people who work hard, in fact, wasn't it Einstein who said that chance favors the prepared mind? Something to that effect. So the theme here is that luck really doesn't play into this. Maybe there's a little bit of stochastic playing around just when you're really close to that pay line and people are on a panel looking, but generally it's not luck. It's really just hard work. The harder I work, the luckier I am. Now there's no plethora of guides like there is in business. Are there people from business here? Anyone from business here? Well, we've all seen in bookshops and things like that, and you see them advertised over and over. There's lots of these. One that I particularly like is this, success after prison, okay? Or we might say success after PhD in some cases here. But there's no good book, or if there are, there's just a few of them about how to write grants, and each person takes it a different way. So I just want to find out a little bit about who you are, and if possible, I'll try and tailor some of my comments to what I think might be of your interest. So I presume most of you are faculty. That's probably fair to say. Are there any, there's a couple of administrators here, staff. Who are those? Who are those folks? Hands up if you're administrator, staff. Okay. And are there any students here? Great. Glad you're here. Welcome. So, you know what you also are guinea pigs. And because, as Pam mentioned, I've given this several times, and as I mentioned, I keep improving this, you're guinea pigs because I'm trying out things on you. So to that end, there's going to be an evaluation sheet. I hope you can pick up the evaluation sheet. If you haven't, we can pause and make sure that you've all got it. And what I'd like to do is get your feedback on what works, what doesn't work, what you think I should mention, and what I'm spending too much time on. So I really will appreciate that. Okay, so who's already written a grant proposal? Okay, so quite a few of you. Who's already received a grant? Feels pretty good, doesn't it? Really feels good. Who's had a proposal declined? Okay, you feel pretty beat up about it because you put all that time and energy into it, and how could they possibly not recognize the brilliance of the ideas in this proposal? And so that doesn't feel very good at all. But I will quote Rocky Balboa here, that Philadelphia philosopher. Every champion was once a contender that refused to give up. And so this factors into the harder I work, the luckier I get, not giving up, being tenacious. Anybody interested in receiving a grant? Yeah, hopefully you all are interested in receiving a grant. So the goal of this workshop really is to change you from a writer to a winner. Terribly arrogant of me to say that, as if I had that power. But again, if just one thing helps one person get a grant, then it's been a day well spent. To learn the business of proposal writing. And I might even add in there the psychology of proposal writing. Because whether you're from the humanities, the social sciences, the sciences, engineering, whatever field you're from, obviously there's a whole bunch of content. But you have to be aware also that there's some tricks, there's a business, there's a way of proceeding that for some people can be more successful. So today's talk is really going to be like a buffet line, okay? It's not going to be a meal that's served to you, but there's going to be a buffet. Some of you are going to like the veggies, and some of you are going to like the fish, and so on. So just take from this what you want and what you think is useful. Now, you may be stuck here for 2 hours, but you don't have to digest all of it for this workshop. So there's going to be several tips, and they're in blue to mark them clearly, okay? Excuse me. So the first tip is pay attention to the tips, because it's in these tips that I've tried to really distill the essence of what it is that I'm trying to say. So there's, I think, about 15 tips, and you'll see them through this. I probably should put together a worksheet that describes all of these tips. So rather than distribute the entire PowerPoint and have to go through and say, what the hell is this guy showing pictures of gurus and things about? You've actually just got the tips there, so I'll work on that. And again, if just one tip helps secure a grant, good job. So some of my tips may succeed only in the humanities and social sciences. Some, I suppose, could only succeed in law. Some might only succeed in medicine. Some certainly might only succeed in sciences and engineering. But most of these tips, I think, will work for all of the disciplines. And I know some of you, as we look around the table here. And the reason for that is that I'm not talking about your discipline. I'm talking about human nature, the human nature of you as a proposal writer, and also the human nature of the people who evaluate your proposal. And you can't think about that without thinking of the psychology of the whole thing. How do I write in a persuasive way that allows the reader to see my message coming through clearly? Oops, I didn't animate that, and I should have. But there's going to be some icons to watch for. So the first one, not a good place to start. There's a few things I'm going to suggest that are just a little bit sneaky. You know, there are things that if you do, you know, you might get a kind of notch up in the score if you do that. But the first one that I meant to show was time management. So you're going to see this little guy here standing on a clock, and anytime that shows up anywhere on the slide, it means you've got to really manage the time and probably anticipate it's going to take more time than you would ever anticipate. So that's what that one is. There's going to be this little icon, which is just a little more sophisticated. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's not common to see these in proposals, but to do this will suggest to the panel that reads your proposal that you're you're just, a little ahead of your peers. You just got an idea of how this whole thing should work. Even if you're clueless, if you put in some of these things, you'll look like a veteran. Another one is, you'll see Sylvester Stallone here as Rocky Balboa show up in various places. And this is to remind you, and I'm sorry that I'm a little bit pugilistic and militaristic in this proposal, but it's the way I view it. It's a fight, it's not an exercise, okay? And the enemy are the folks who read your proposal, and you've got to conquer them. And when you see this, this is one of the best pictures of a skeptic I think I've ever seen. But if you see this, it means, remember those skeptical reviewers. They're not going to automatically jump to your side. They're not going to automatically assume that you know what you're talking about or that your point is clear. So always keep in mind that there's that skeptical bunch of reviewers out there. And then, as I said, a little bit sneaky. So I'm going to start, and some of this may not be at all relevant for you. Some of it might be interesting just to tuck away. Some of you it may be actually very fundamental to what you're trying to do. But I want to differentiate between contracts and grants in the public and the private space. So here we've got a Venn diagram with private and public space. We've got contracts and we've got grants. So a contract is pretty much within the sphere of the private world. You get a contract with Texas Instruments. You get a contract with AstraZeneca. Sometimes you'll get a contract with a state agency. And a grant, on the other hand, well, it kind of slides between both of this. There could be grants from the private sphere, for example, but anything like a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, anything like a National Science Foundation grant, National Institutes of Health, all of these are primarily from the public domain here. So let's start by talking about contracts in the private domain. So a contract is usually with a company. It's a specific product is dictated. The company wants 500 screwdrivers with a black plastic grip, a yellow body made out of stainless steel with multiple implements. They're not saying to you, if we gave you some money, what sort of tools would you build? Or if we gave you some money, would you make a Phillips screwdriver or a slot screwdriver? A contract is generally very specific. And not only do they say that they want a particular type of tool, they want 500 of them, and they want them by March 18th. So a contract typically really lays down very clear things. What a company looks for when they're looking to execute a contract with someone, obviously the ability. Do you generally have the ability? We could define ability in a number of different ways. Do you have the capability? You may be able to do something, but are you capable of doing it in the time frame of what the company wants? And do you have the capacity? Maybe you're really able to make good screwdrivers, and you're capable because you've shown before you can make yellow screwdrivers, but can you make 500 of them by March 18th? So companies are interested in that, in contracts. And then finally, I suppose in a way, all of the things to the left of that last arrow come down to competence. If they're involved with you, are you competent? Are you going to deliver on this contract when you say you do? And then finally, delivery. So this is the kind of sequence that companies executing a private contract want to look for. So just as an example, I've got just recently, or in the process with our UNT legal team, getting a small contract with AstraZeneca in Gothenburg, Sweden. They have some chemicals they want tested. I said, well, I could do this and this and this. And they said, no, we want to know about this aspect of the biology of these chemicals on, it turns out, an animal model, a fish model. They didn't want to entertain Any other views? They've got 10 chemicals. They're actually sending them to us. I don't know what they are. It's going to be AZ1, AZ2, AZ3, and so on. But we will test the cardiovascular effects of this chemical. And we've got 9 months to do it. They're going to send us these 10 compounds, and we've agreed to provide this data. So that's very much in line with what a contract is. Anybody here had a contract? Yeah, Ione, I know you've had a contract, and some others have had a contract. So is this kind of more or less your feel for what a company wants? Yep, okay, they want to deliver. So contracts with companies are nice because typically there's less red tape and less administration. I say typically, not always the case. But whether you're going with, into these companies, this is the one I want. I want that contract right there. I'm not a microbiologist and dealing with yeast, but maybe it's a quality control process. That might be pretty good. But there's less red tape and administration. But it's not all sweetness and light, because companies, although they're good at funding projects, are not necessarily logical, not necessarily predictable. And I don't know if this has been your experience, but sometimes you execute a contract and after 3 weeks or 3 months they phone you up and say, well, no, actually we want you to do this, or we want you to do this. And then the thing that I've discovered with contracts is the quarterly reports that are due every 3 weeks, or at least it seems like that they want you to just provide lots and lots of feedback. It's kind of odd in a way. They trust you to give you their money, but then maybe Reagan-esque, it's trust but verify, because they want all these quarterly reports to show that what you're doing is appropriate. And I asked here already who's had a contract. Okay, so let's now turn to grants. And I'm guessing that most of you are here because you are interested in grants, but I hope at least having that background of the difference between a contract and grant has been just a little bit useful. So a grant is more about ideas and problems, about hypotheses. You've got some ideas, you want to test them to varying degrees with varying agencies and varying programs. You can be loose in terms of what you suggest. You're not going to make a screwdriver. You're going to say, I bet if we had better tools, we could do X, Y, and Z. Not, I'm going to make a yellow-handled screwdriver. Specific product or specific budget is rarely dictated. Usually a grant will have a cap, no more than $500,000 over 3 years. But what they don't say is that your particular, or the particular project that we're thinking about will have a budget of X. That's really for you to come up with. But they've usually got a cap. The competence aspect is still important. In this case, the capability, capacity, competence aspect is likely to be in terms of your track record as an academic or your track record as an administrator. And so your competence is demonstrated by how you've done this before. And I realize how circular and frustrating this can be, because if you haven't had a grant before, how can you demonstrate that you're competent in administering a grant? And the best advice I can give there is that the substitute for grants is publications. And so if you've been successfully publishing, that without a grant, that might even suggest that you're really frugal. Because if you can produce a product with no money, wow, what could you do if you actually had money? So that's let's look now at public and private, having talked about grants and contracts. So typically, grants come from private foundations or public agencies. This is a pretty broad brush that I'm writing with, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll put it in these two categories: foundations, private; agencies, public. So if we look at foundations first, Texas Instruments, okay? Every one of us who's got a cell phone on our person has got a little piece of Texas Instruments in there, because they make some of the principal components that go into all sorts of electronics. You have to differentiate between Texas Instruments, the corporation, and Texas Instruments Foundation. Almost all large companies will have, if they're interested in any sort of grant giving, any sort of philanthropy, will set up a separate, legally separate foundation. And if you happen to live in the same neighborhood as someone who's with Texas Instruments, the corporation, you say, well, I can go knock on their door and pitch them this idea. That's a waste of time. That's not who deals with these sorts of things. Even if you go to an engineer who makes widgets and you've got an idea for a widget, that widget engineer is in no position to directly influence any sort of grant that you might receive. What you want to do is focus on the foundation, Texas Instruments Foundation. Now, if you can get that widget engineer to put in a good word for you, or write a letter of reference or something, that's fine. But the pathway to fame and glory and riches is through the foundations. And as I said, they're typically legally separate, and this is going to be your contact. So why do foundations of private companies give grants? It's important to know this because you can be a little sneaky here and work the system if you really understand what's motivating a foundation to give money. So the first thing that foundations like to do, because remember behind the foundation is that mega corporation that can afford this. So whether it's BP or whether it's Shell or whether it's Johnson & Johnson or whether it's Texas Instruments, one of the things they want to do is cozy up to a university because they have access to the library, to technology, and to faculty. And so by establishing that relationship, that's a value added to that foundation through that company through the foundation. So what you want to do is make sure that you provide clearly that you have juice, so to speak, in the academic world here at UNT. Now, related to that, companies will often want to establish relationships with universities because it's access to employees. Our graduate students, our undergraduate students are all potential employers. And so there are, beyond mere job fairs, we often see large companies on our campus, but beyond that, there can be a relationship that's established through a small or hopefully a large grant from a foundation. And what they're getting out of it is not only knowing that you're going to do good work, but also you're going to send them your very best and brightest because you want to keep that money stream coming. So you send them, you don't send them the doofuses that barely made it through your courses. You send them the really good folks, okay? So employees is another reason. Let's hang it right out there. Taxes, okay? It's a huge tax incentive for companies. I think even under the newly reconfigured tax structure for corporations, there's still going to be a lot of tax deductions. And when companies give away to charities, they get a big tax deduction. Are any of you from the Research Park? Yep. You may or may not know the history. That used to be a Sparrow missile assembly, or at least it was planned to be, and by Texas Instruments. And they had we had the good luck that they went out to and spent a huge amount of money as a government contractor building that research park out there. And then had the bad luck of wanting to make missiles just as the Cold War was ending. And so that plant never actually assembled any missiles. And it was mothballed by Texas Instruments for, I think, 12, 14 years. When it finally sold, when UNT bought it, it won the Texas Real Estate Deal of the Year award. And the reason for that was we got it for $14 a square foot. $14 a square foot. And Texas Instruments got to write the whole thing off because UNT is a charity. So it's like, who's not smiling about this deal, okay? So don't, I mean, this isn't something you put in your proposal, oh yeah, you can save taxes. But just realize that it's not all noble about why they may be doing this. And then another important part here, and don't underestimate this, is the sheer publicity that comes from giving out grants to various philanthropic causes. I'll give you a little example here. Ed Mager, a biologist, and I are collaborating on a grant that we got that follows this line. So, British Petroleum, you know, this highly venerated, well-known company throughout the world. And I don't know if you heard or not, they made a little bit of a mess in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. I shouldn't make fun of it because 11 people lost their life in that. But British Petroleum had this problem, huge publicity problem. And what they did was create the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. They took a $500 million, B with a billion with a B. And they created this research foundation and basically said, we want to see long-term research done in the Gulf of Mexico, and we want to see this great science done, and we want to create a legacy of data. And parenthetically, we want to soften up the jury pool, because we're going to be on the hook for maybe, what, Ed, $60 billion, something like that was what the estimated possible litigation would be for British Petroleum. So they created this, and don't get me wrong, it's really a beautifully run organization. Lots of really interesting science come out of it. But guess what? British Petroleum settled for $30 billion. They could have been on the hook for $60+ billion. And part of it is because they can say, you know, we're a great company. We did a bad thing in the Gulf of Mexico, but then we turned around and are funding all of these scientists to understand what happens when the next oil spill occurs. So we're really a pretty good company. So I'm being cynical here, and I shouldn't be too cynical, because the consortium that I'm in, we pulled $15 million over 5 years out of this Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. But we do know that this foundation is really interested in public outreach. They spend probably about a quarter of their budget, one way or the other, on public outreach, because they want the publicity, the positive publicity that comes from it. So, a key point here with philanthropic foundations, I'll mention one more. Then there's different ones like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And as you may know, they've been focused very heavily on malaria and the eradication of malaria. You know, it's funny how many of these unfathomably rich, initially young men, start out and they don't understand the concept of philanthropy. And apparently Michael Dell's dad, Bill Gates' dad, had to sit him down and say, Michael, Bill, how much money do you need? You're among the richest people in the world. How many toys do you need? Give this away. Do something good. That's the real legacy that you can create. And so Bill and Melinda got conscience and started establishing these foundations. So the second tip here, be strategic. Know what motivates these privates. If you want to go to a foundation, find out what motivates them. And the best way to do that is often by checking out their funding history. Almost all of these foundations, even if they're private and are not obligated to do so, will give indications of what they've funded in the past. And that's really good intel, is to see what sort of things they've funded. So it's a little bit of a more sophisticated approach to do some background searching on these foundations. Find out what motivates them, and then while being true to your ideas, deliver what they want. Now, one important thing to point out, and I'm sure if we had any of our grant administration or foundation development folks here today, is that the administration is different at this university and almost all universities, different offices and different staff. So if you're doing foundation sorts of work, you'll often work through our foundation office. If you're doing a grant with a large